Beneath the waves of the North Sea lies a secret that could rewrite everything we thought we knew about prehistoric Europe. A vast landscape once stretched from Britain to Denmark, supporting thriving communities for thousands of years until something catastrophic happened that wiped it from existence forever. This is the story of Doggerland, a sophisticated landscape filled with villages, burial grounds, and hunting camps that supported some of Europe's most advanced Stone Age communities. Recent discoveries on the seafloor have revealed how this lost world ended, not gradually, but in a catastrophic event so sudden and devastating that it left scars we can still detect today. Here's what makes this extraordinary. Doggerland wasn't just flooded land. It was a continental landscape larger than modern Britain, where people hunted mammoth, built settlements along rivers that no longer exist, and maintained trade networks spanning hundreds of miles. And the way it ended, the final event that sealed its fate, happened so fast that entire communities had no warning. We're going back 8,000 years to explore a lost world that challenges everything archaeologists thought they knew about prehistoric Europe. You'll discover the hunters, fishermen, and families who called this vanished continent home, and the shocking truth about how quickly an entire civilization can disappear when nature unleashes its full force. If you're fascinated by stories of lost civilizations and ancient disasters, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more historical mysteries like this one. The year is approximately 6,200 BC, and if you could stand where the North Sea churns today, you'd find yourself in the heart of one of prehistoric Europe's most remarkable landscapes. Doggerland stretched across an area roughly the size of modern-day Britain, connecting what we now call the British Isles to continental Europe through a vast expanse of rolling hills, dense forests, and meandering rivers that supported wildlife populations beyond anything we can imagine today. Picture this ancient world awakening with the dawn. Massive herds of aurochs, the wild ancestors of domestic cattle, move across grasslands that seem to stretch endlessly toward every horizon. These weren't the small cattle we know today, but enormous beasts standing 6 feet tall at the shoulder, their massive horns gleaming in the morning light as they graze alongside equally impressive red deer, whose antlers span wider than a man can reach. In the deeper forests that cover much of this lost continent, brown bears lumber through undergrowth thick with hazelnuts and wild berries, while wolves move in coordinated packs through shadows cast by oak trees, so ancient and massive that their trunks would dwarf the largest specimens surviving in Europe today. Overhead, the skies darken periodically with flocks of birds, so numerous that their passage blocks the sun for hours at a time, their calls creating a symphony of life that modern Europeans have never heard. But Doggerland's most impressive inhabitants aren't found in its forests or grasslands. Along the countless rivers and streams that drain this vast landscape toward the surrounding seas, populations of beaver have created engineering projects that rival anything humans would accomplish for thousands of years to come. Their dams stretch across valleys, creating elaborate networks of wetlands that support incredible biodiversity, while fundamentally altering the flow of water across the entire continent. These beaver-engineered landscapes create perfect hunting grounds for the human communities that have made Doggerland their home for countless generations. The Mesolithic peoples who inhabit this lost world have developed sophisticated understanding of their environment, reading the subtle signs that indicate where game will move with the seasons, when fish runs will peak in the rivers, and which areas will provide the richest harvests of nuts, berries, and edible plants. Archaeological evidence recovered from the North Sea floor reveals that these weren't primitive wanderers struggling to survive in a hostile wilderness. Instead, they represent some of Europe's most advanced Stone Age cultures, with tool technologies and artistic traditions that demonstrate remarkable sophistication and cultural continuity spanning thousands of years. Their flint tools, preserved in underwater deposits where they were dropped or lost 8,000 years ago, show craftsmanship that required generations of accumulated knowledge to perfect. These aren't crude implements chipped hastily from convenient stones. but carefully designed instruments created using techniques so advanced that modern experimental archaeologists struggle to replicate them even with detailed knowledge of the processes involved. The microliths they produced, tiny geometric flint tools designed to be hafted into wooden handles or arrow shafts, represent a pinnacle of Stone Age technology. Each piece required precise understanding of how stone fractures under specific types of pressure, combined with manual dexterity developed through years of practice. When assembled into composite tools, these microliths created cutting implements sharper than modern steel, capable of taking down the largest animals while remaining light enough for extended hunting expeditions. But the true sophistication of Doggerland's inhabitants becomes apparent when we examine their seasonal movement patterns and settlement strategies. Rather than wandering randomly across the landscape in search of food, these communities followed carefully planned annual cycles that maximize their access to different resources throughout the year. During spring months, many groups concentrated along rivers and coastlines, where massive fish runs provided opportunities to harvest enough protein to support large gatherings. Archaeological evidence suggests these seasonal aggregations weren't just about food procurement, but served crucial social functions that maintained cultural connections across the vast Doggerland landscape. These spring gatherings provided opportunities for young adults from different bands to meet potential partners, ensuring genetic diversity within populations that might otherwise become isolated. Skilled crafters shared techniques for tool production, artistic traditions, and technological innovations, creating networks of cultural exchange that spanned hundreds of miles. Elder members of different communities shared oral histories and accumulated environmental knowledge, passing down information about weather patterns, animal behavior, and resource availability that enabled subsequent generations to thrive in an environment that demanded intimate understanding of countless subtle ecological relationships. As summer progressed and fish runs diminished, these large gatherings would break apart into smaller groups that dispersed across Doggerland's interior to take advantage of different seasonal opportunities. Some bands followed herds of red deer and aurochs as they moved to summer grazing areas, while others concentrated on harvesting the incredible abundance of nuts, berries, and other plant foods that ripened throughout the warmer months. The hazelnut groves that covered much of Doggerland provided particularly important resources that could be processed and stored to sustain communities through leaner winter periods. Archaeological evidence from underwater sites shows that these Stone Age peoples developed sophisticated techniques for processing and preserving nuts that enabled them to maintain stable food supplies throughout the year. Autumn brought opportunities for major hunting campaigns as animals fattened themselves for winter survival. The elaborate antler frontlets discovered at the famous Starcar site in Yorkshire, which was once part of the greater Doggerland landscape, suggest that these hunting expeditions involved complex ritual preparations and ceremonial elements that reinforce social bonds while ensuring successful hunts. These antler headdresses, painstakingly carved and shaped to be worn by human hunters, required dozens of hours of skilled labor to create. Their discovery suggests that hunting wasn't merely a practical activity focused on food procurement, but carried deep spiritual significance that connected human communities to the animal world they depended upon for survival. Winter months saw these dispersed bands gathering in sheltered locations where they could wait out the harsh weather while engaging in the detailed craftwork that sustained their material culture. This was the season for creating the elaborate tools, weapons, and artistic objects that archaeologists continue to recover from underwater Doggerland sites. The bone and antler artifacts preserved in North Sea sediments reveal artistic traditions of remarkable sophistication. Carved fish spears show decorative elements that serve no practical function, but demonstrate aesthetic sensibilities that rival anything produced by contemporary cultures elsewhere in Europe. Personal ornaments made from pierced animal teeth and carved amber beads indicate social systems complex enough to support specialized craft production and long-distance trade networks. But perhaps most remarkably, the distribution of these artifacts across the North Sea floor suggests that Doggerland's inhabitants maintained cultural connections across the entire expanse of their lost continent. Similar tool styles and artistic motifs appear at sites separated by hundreds of miles, indicating either extensive population movements or trade networks that facilitated the spread of ideas and techniques across vast distances. The amber beads discovered at multiple Doggerland sites provide particularly compelling evidence for these long-distance connections. Amber sources in this region were concentrated in specific geological formations, meaning that finished beads found far from these source areas must have travelled through either trade networks or population movements that spanned the entire Doggerland landscape. These trade networks weren't limited to luxury items like amber jewellery. Stone tool raw materials show similar patterns of long-distance movement, with high-quality flints from specific quarry sites appearing in archaeological assemblages hundreds of miles away. This suggests that Doggerland's inhabitants had developed sophisticated understanding of resource distribution across their landscape and maintained social relationships that enabled them to access the best available materials regardless of their local availability. The seasonal rounds and trade networks that sustained these communities for thousands of years created a complex web of human relationships that stretched across an area larger than modern Britain. When catastrophe finally came to Doggerland, it wouldn't just destroy a landscape, but would shatter social connections and cultural traditions that had developed over millennia of careful adaptation to this unique environment. But before we can understand how this remarkable world came to its catastrophic end, we need to examine the geological processes that had been slowly transforming Doggerland throughout the thousands of years that humans called it home. The same natural forces that had created this vast continental landscape were already beginning to reclaim it, setting the stage for a disaster that would unfold with terrifying speed when the final trigger event occurred. The story of Doggerland's destruction begins not with a single catastrophic moment, but with gradual changes that had been reshaping the landscape for thousands of years before the final disaster struck. As the last ice age slowly released its grip on northern Europe, massive ice sheets that had covered Scandinavia for tens of thousands of years began their gradual retreat northward. This melting process unleashed geological forces so powerful they continue to reshape the landscape today, though few people realize the dramatic changes still occurring beneath our feet. The weight of ice sheets miles thick had pressed down on the Scandinavian landmass with such tremendous force that the entire region had been compressed downward like a giant spring. As these ice sheets melted and their crushing weight disappeared, the land began to rebound upward in a process geologists call isostatic adjustment. This wasn't a gentle, gradual lifting, but a powerful geological force that tilted entire continental regions and fundamentally altered the flow of rivers and seas across northern Europe. Picture the landscape of Doggerland as a vast seesaw with Scandinavia on one end and the British Isles on the other. As the Scandinavian end rose due to post-glacial rebound, the opposite end began to sink. This meant that while mountains in Norway were slowly climbing higher into the sky, the low-lying plains of Doggerland were gradually subsiding towards sea level. At first, this subsidence occurred so slowly that human communities could easily adapt to the changing conditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that Doggerland's inhabitants adjusted their settlement patterns and seasonal movements to accommodate gradually shifting coastlines and changing river courses. What had once been inland hunting camps might become coastal fishing stations over the course of several generations. But these changes unfolded slowly enough that traditional knowledge and cultural practices could evolve alongside the transforming landscape. Meanwhile, the melting ice sheets were contributing massive volumes of water to the world's oceans. During the peak of the last ice age, so much water had been locked up in continental ice sheets that global sea levels stood nearly 400 feet lower than they do today. As these ice sheets melted, the released water flowed back into ocean basins, causing sea levels to rise steadily around the world. This global sea level rise affected different regions at different rates, depending on their distance from the melting ice sheets, and their position relative to various geological processes. For Doggerland, the combination of rising seas and subsiding land created a double threat that gradually reduced the habitable area available to human communities. The eastern margins of Doggerland, closest to the rising Scandinavian landmass, remained relatively stable for longer periods. Archaeological sites in these areas show evidence of continuous human occupation spanning thousands of years, with successive generations building new settlements directly on top of older ones as they adapted to slowly changing environmental conditions. But along the western and southern edges of Doggerland, where subsidence was most pronounced, communities faced increasingly frequent flooding events that forced them to abandon traditional settlement areas and seek higher ground. These weren't the catastrophic floods that would eventually destroy the entire region, but gradual encroachment of saltwater into areas that had been freshwater environments for millennia. The advancing seas transformed Doggerland's landscape in ways that went far beyond simple flooding. As salt water penetrated inland along river valleys and low-lying areas, it killed the vast forests that had provided shelter and resources for countless generations of human inhabitants. Dead trees created obstacles to navigation and hunting, while the loss of forest cover altered local climate patterns and reduced the availability of game animals that depended on woodland habitats. The intrusion of saltwater also contaminated freshwater sources that human communities depended upon for drinking water and food preparation. Springs and streams that had provided reliable water supplies for thousands of years became brackish and eventually undrinkable, forcing people to travel longer distances to find suitable water sources or to develop new techniques for water procurement and storage. Perhaps most significantly, the advancing seas disrupted the elaborate beaver dam systems that had created much of Doggerland's productive wetland habitat. These engineering marvels, built and maintained by countless generations of beavers, couldn't adapt quickly enough to changing water levels and salinity. As the dam systems failed, they released massive volumes of impounded water while simultaneously destroying the wetland ecosystems that had supported incredible biodiversity and provided prime hunting opportunities for human communities. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing signs of stress in Doggerland's human populations. Tool assemblages become less diverse, suggesting that people had less time available for specialized craft production, as they devoted more energy to basic survival in an increasingly challenging environment. Settlement sites show evidence of more frequent abandonment and reoccupation, indicating that communities were being forced to move more often as environmental conditions deteriorated. Trade networks that had connected communities across vast distances began to break down as rising seas cut traditional travel routes and forced populations to concentrate in smaller areas of remaining high ground. The amber beads and exotic stone tools that had once moved freely across the entire Doggerland landscape become increasingly rare in archaeological assemblages from this period, suggesting that the social connections enabling long-distance exchange were being severed by environmental changes. But despite these mounting pressures, Doggerland's human communities showed remarkable resilience and adaptability. Rather than simply abandoning the region as conditions deteriorated, they developed new survival strategies that enabled them to continue thriving in an increasingly maritime environment. Coastal settlements from this period show evidence of increasingly sophisticated boat-building technologies and maritime hunting techniques. The people of late-period Doggerland became accomplished seafarers who could navigate the expanding network of channels and islands that their landscape was becoming. Fish bones and marine mammal remains become much more common in archaeological assemblages, indicating that these communities successfully transitioned from primarily terrestrial to increasingly marine-focused subsistence strategies. Some groups developed specialized techniques for hunting seals and other marine mammals that gathered in large numbers around the rocky outcrops and small islands that remained above the rising waters. Others focused on exploiting the rich fishing opportunities that developed where freshwater rivers met the advancing sea, creating estuarine environments that supported enormous populations of migratory fish. The most adaptable communities learned to follow the seasonal movements of waterfowl that used the expanding wetlands as stopover points during their annual migrations. These bird populations provided not only meat and eggs for food, but feathers for insulation and decoration, bones for tools, and other materials that supported increasingly complex material cultures adapted to maritime environments. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Doggerland communities even developed early forms of aquaculture, managing freshwater pools and coastal lagoons to maximize fish and shellfish production. Shell middens from this period show evidence of systematic harvesting that maintained sustainable populations of marine resources over extended periods, indicating sophisticated understanding of marine ecology and resource management. But even as human communities adapted to their changing world, the geological and climatic forces reshaping Doggerland continued to accelerate. The rate of sea level rise was increasing as more distant ice sheets began contributing meltwater to the oceans, while the subsidence of the Doggerland region accelerated due to additional geological processes that compounded the effects of post-glacial rebound. Deep beneath the North Sea floor, sediment layers deposited during this period preserve a detailed record of environmental changes that were occurring faster than ecosystems could adapt. Pollen samples show rapid transitions from forest to grassland, to salt marsh, to open marine environments occurring over periods of decades rather than centuries, indicating that the pace of environmental change was accelerating beyond the adaptive capacity of many species. The climate itself was becoming increasingly unstable as the complex interactions between melting ice sheets, changing ocean currents, and shifting weather patterns created conditions unlike anything that had existed during the previous thousands of years of stable environmental conditions. Temperature and precipitation patterns became increasingly erratic, making it difficult for human communities to predict seasonal resource availability using traditional ecological knowledge that had sustained them for countless generations. By around 6,500 BC, much of what had once been the vast continental expanse of Doggerland had been reduced to an archipelago of islands and peninsulas connected by increasingly narrow land bridges that flooded regularly during storms and high tides. The remaining high ground supported human populations that had become concentrated in much smaller areas, creating resource pressures and social tensions that hadn't existed when people could disperse across the entire continental landscape. Competition for remaining resources intensified as populations that had once occupied distinct territories were forced into closer contact with one another. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing emphasis on defensive site locations and the development of new weapon technologies that may have been designed for warfare rather than hunting, suggesting that social conflicts were becoming more common as environmental pressures mounted. Yet even under these increasingly difficult conditions, the resilient communities of late Doggerland continued to maintain their cultural traditions and social connections. Burial sites from this period show continued investment in ceremonial activities and artistic production, indicating that people retained their spiritual beliefs and cultural identity even as their physical world transformed around them. The bone and antler artifacts recovered from these late period sites demonstrate continued mastery of traditional craft techniques, while also showing innovations that reflect adaptation to new environmental conditions. Fishing spears become more elaborate and specialized, while new types of tools appear that were specifically designed for processing marine resources and working with materials like sealskin and whalebone. But time was running out for this remarkable adaptive response. The same geological processes that had been gradually reshaping Doggerland for thousands of years were approaching a critical threshold that would trigger the most catastrophic natural disaster in European prehistory. Deep beneath the Norwegian Sea, massive underwater landslides were building toward an event so devastating that it would destroy what remained of Doggerland in a matter of hours, erasing 8,000 years of human adaptation and cultural development in one of the most sudden environmental catastrophes ever recorded in the geological record. The stage was set for the Storegga slide, and when it finally occurred around 6,200 BC, it would unleash forces that would reshape the geography of northwestern Europe forever. The morning of the disaster began, like countless others across the scattered islands that remained of once mighty Doggerland. Children splashed in tidal pools, while their parents prepared nets for the day's fishing. Elderly craftsmen sat in doorways of sturdy wooden shelters, working seal bone into harpoon points with techniques passed down through generations. Smoke rose from cooking fires where families shared meals of fresh fish and preserved nuts, unaware they were living through the final hours of their ancient homeland. In settlements across the archipelago, daily routines unfolded with the comfortable predictability that comes from thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about tides, weather, and seasonal patterns. Women gathered shellfish from exposed mudflats during low tide, their woven baskets filling with the mollusks that had become a dietary staple for these maritime communities. Young men prepared their boats for offshore fishing expeditions, checking the waterproof seams made from pine resin and animal fat that kept their vessels seaworthy in increasingly challenging conditions. The most experienced hunters studied the horizon for signs of migrating seal herds, reading subtle changes in wave patterns and bird behavior that indicated the presence of marine mammals beneath the surface. Their knowledge represented the culmination of countless generations of observation and experimentation, refined through trial and error into an understanding of marine ecology that rivaled anything modern science would achieve for thousands of years. But far beneath the waves of the Norwegian Sea, approximately 300 miles northeast of the peaceful settlements, geological forces that had been building for millennia were reaching a catastrophic breaking point. Along the edge of the continental shelf, where the seafloor drops away into oceanic depths, enormous accumulations of sediment had been depositing for thousands of years, as glacial meltwater carried massive quantities of sand, silt, and clay from the retreating ice sheets. These sediment deposits, some reaching thicknesses of several hundred feet, had created an increasingly unstable situation along the steep underwater slopes of the continental margin. The weight of accumulated material, combined with rising sea levels that altered pressure conditions on the sea floor, had created conditions comparable to an enormous landslide waiting to happen on a scale that dwarfed anything possible on dry land. Deep within these underwater sediment layers, pockets of methane gas had been accumulating for thousands of years as organic matter decomposed under the immense pressure of overlying materials. This gas created zones of weakness within the sediment mass, like bubbles in bread dough that reduce structural integrity and create potential failure points under stress. The specific trigger that finally destabilized this massive underwater formation remains unclear to modern scientists, but the most likely explanation involves a combination of factors that created a cascade of geological failure. Rising sea levels may have altered pressure conditions just enough to destabilize gas pockets within the sediment layers, while seismic activity from post-glacial crustal adjustments could have provided the final shock necessary to initiate catastrophic slope failure. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed across an area of sea floor larger than Iceland. Approximately 1,200 cubic miles of sediment, an amount equivalent to a layer of material several feet thick covering the entire state of Texas, began sliding down the continental slope in what geologists now recognize as one of the largest submarine landslides in Earth's recent history. The Storegga slide, named after the Norwegian coastal region nearest to the disaster zone, wasn't a single massive movement, but rather a series of interconnected failures that occurred over a period of several hours. As initial slope failures destabilized adjacent areas, the landslide propagated across hundreds of miles of continental margin, creating a submarine avalanche of unprecedented proportions. The sliding sediment masses displaced enormous volumes of seawater as they plunged into the abyssal depths of the Norwegian Sea. This displacement created pressure waves that radiated outward from the failure zone at speeds approaching those of modern jet aircraft, carrying energy sufficient to devastate coastlines thousands of miles away. But the people of Doggerland had no way to detect the approaching catastrophe. Unlike earthquakes, which produce ground tremors that can provide minutes or even hours of warning before the most destructive waves arrive, submarine landslides generate tsunamis with virtually no advance warning for distant coastal populations. The first indication of danger would be the arrival of the waves themselves. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Doggerland communities may have noticed unusual animal behavior in the hours preceding the disaster. Marine mammals and seabirds often detect the subtle pressure changes and low-frequency sounds that precede major geological events, and their unusual movements might have puzzled human observers accustomed to reading natural signs for information about environmental conditions. Fishing crews working offshore waters may have observed strange wave patterns or unusual water movements that didn't correspond to normal tidal cycles or weather conditions. The most experienced mariners might have recognized these anomalies as signs of danger and attempted to return to shore, though their traditional knowledge provided no framework for understanding the unprecedented threat approaching from the northeast. The first waves to reach Doggerland's scattered communities arrived approximately 2 hours after the initial slope failure, traveling across hundreds of miles of open ocean while maintaining much of their devastating energy. These weren't the gentle swells that coastal populations had learned to read and predict, but walls of water moving with the force of geological catastrophe. The leading edge of the tsunami appeared on the horizon as a dark line that initially might have been mistaken for an approaching storm front. But as the wave train drew closer, its true nature became unmistakably terrifying. The first wave rose to heights of more than 60 feet above normal sea level, a moving mountain of water that dwarfed anything in the experience of people whose ancestors had lived along these coasts for thousands of years. Unlike wind-driven waves that break and dissipate their energy in white foam, tsunami waves maintain their structural integrity until they encounter shallow water or obstacles. The approaching wall of water maintained its towering height as it crossed the relatively shallow waters surrounding Doggerland's remaining islands, carrying with it the accumulated force of the massive landslide that had generated it. For the communities scattered across Doggerland's archipelago, the sight of this approaching wave must have been beyond comprehension. Their traditional stories contained accounts of great floods from the distant past, oral histories that preserved memories of earlier periods when rising seas had forced their ancestors to abandon traditional territories. But those earlier floods had unfolded over years or decades, allowing time for adaptation and relocation. Nothing in their cultural memory prepared them for the speed and scale of the destruction bearing down on them. The waves struck the easternmost islands first, obliterating settlements that had stood for generations in a matter of minutes. Wooden structures that had weathered countless storms were swept away like debris, while carefully maintained storage caches of preserved food and essential tools disappeared beneath the churning waters. Boats that represented months of skilled labor and irreplaceable transportation capability were torn from their moorings and carried inland before being smashed against whatever obstacles they encountered. The human cost was immediate and devastating. Communities that had successfully adapted to thousands of years of gradual environmental change found themselves facing a catastrophe that unfolded faster than people could react. Families were separated as the rushing water swept away anyone unable to reach high ground in the few minutes available between the wave's appearance on the horizon and its arrival at the shore. Those who managed to climb trees or reach elevated positions watched in horror as their entire world was transformed in moments. The familiar landscape of tidal pools, shellfish beds, and shallow lagoons that had provided sustenance for countless generations disappeared beneath the churning waters. Settlement sites that had been occupied continuously for thousands of years vanished completely, leaving no trace of the sophisticated communities that had called them home. But the first wave was only the beginning of the catastrophe. Tsunami events generated by massive submarine landslides typically consist of multiple wave trains that can continue arriving for hours after the initial impact. As the first wave receded, carrying with it the debris of destroyed settlements and any unfortunate individuals caught in its path, survivors might have hoped the worst was over. Instead, they faced the terrifying realization that additional waves were approaching from the same direction. The second and third waves, while somewhat smaller than the initial impact, struck communities already devastated by the first assault. Buildings that had survived the initial flooding were undermined by the repeated inundation, while survivors who had taken refuge on high ground watched helplessly as the retreating waters carried away the remnants of their material culture. The psychological impact of witnessing such complete destruction must have been as devastating as the physical damage. These communities had developed a sophisticated understanding of their environment through thousands of years of accumulated observation and experience. Their survival strategies were based on reading natural signs and predicting environmental changes using traditional knowledge that had proven reliable across countless generations. The tsunami represented a complete breakdown of this predictive framework. The disaster struck without warning from a direction where no threat had ever appeared, moving with speeds that made traditional evacuation strategies useless and carrying destruction on a scale that exceeded anything in their cultural memory. The very foundation of their environmental knowledge, built up over millennia of careful observation, proved inadequate to protect them from forces operating on geological rather than human timescales. As the waves continued to batter Doggerland's remaining high ground throughout that terrible day, the survivors faced the gradual realization that their world had changed forever. The low-lying areas that had supported the majority of their settlements were now permanently submerged beneath several feet of additional seawater. The carefully maintained resource areas where they had harvested shellfish, gathered edible plants, and hunted waterfowl had been scoured clean by the passing waves and contaminated by saltwater and debris. The social networks that had connected communities across the archipelago were severed as completely as if they had never existed. Boats that had enabled travel and communication between settlements were destroyed, while the people who had maintained these connections were scattered, missing, or dead. The trade relationships that had moved exotic materials and cultural innovations across vast distances collapsed immediately, leaving surviving communities isolated and dependent entirely on whatever resources remained within walking distance of their devastated settlements. Even more fundamentally, the disaster had destroyed the accumulated material culture that represented thousands of years of technological and artistic development. The specialized tools that had enabled efficient hunting and fishing, the ceremonial objects that had maintained spiritual and cultural traditions, and the preserved food supplies that had provided security against seasonal scarcity, all disappeared beneath the waves in a matter of hours. The knowledge systems that had sustained these communities faced equally devastating losses as the disaster claimed many of the elder individuals who served as repositories of traditional ecological knowledge, historical information, and technical expertise. Craft techniques that had required years to master, oral histories that preserved cultural identity across generations, and environmental wisdom that had enabled sustainable resource management for millennia were lost when their human carriers perished in the flooding. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming catastrophe, the survivors of Doggerland's destruction demonstrated the same resilience and adaptability that had enabled their ancestors to thrive through thousands of years of gradual environmental change. Small groups of people who had managed to reach safety began the immediate work of survival, salvaging whatever materials they could find among the debris and beginning the process of adaptation to their transformed world. The few boats that had survived the disaster became precious resources that enabled limited travel between the scattered patches of remaining high ground. Fishing equipment that had washed ashore or been carried to safety before the waves arrived provided the means to exploit marine resources in an environment that had become almost entirely aquatic. The skills and knowledge that survived in the memories of the scattered survivors became the foundation for new survival strategies adapted to their drastically altered circumstances. But the Storegga tsunami had accomplished more than the destruction of settlements and the displacement of human populations. The massive waves had fundamentally altered the geography of northwestern Europe, completing the transformation of Doggerland from a continental landscape into a marine environment. The remaining islands and peninsulas that had provided refuge during the immediate disaster were now isolated patches of land surrounded by much deeper water than had existed before the submarine landslide. The wave energy had scoured away sediments that had accumulated over thousands of years, deepening channels and creating new underwater topography that changed current patterns and tidal flows throughout the region. Areas that had been shallow enough for easy boat travel were now too deep for traditional fishing techniques, while new underwater obstacles created navigation hazards that made travel between settlements dangerous and unpredictable. The ecological consequences of the disaster extended far beyond the immediate destruction of human communities. The tsunami had devastated marine ecosystems that had developed over thousands of years in the shallow waters surrounding Doggerland. Shellfish beds that had provided reliable protein sources for human communities were buried under debris or scoured away entirely. Fish populations that had followed predictable seasonal migration patterns through the region found their traditional routes disrupted by changed underwater topography. The massive influx of sediment and debris stirred up by the waves had contaminated water sources and altered salinity levels throughout the region. Freshwater springs that had provided drinking water for coastal communities were overwhelmed by saltwater, while the organic matter churned up from the seafloor created conditions that reduced oxygen levels and made large areas temporarily uninhabitable for marine life. Even the climate of the region began to change, as the altered geography affected local weather patterns. The deeper waters that now covered much of the former Doggerland landscape absorbed and released heat differently than the previous combination of land and shallow seas, creating new patterns of fog, precipitation, and wind that survivors had to learn to interpret and predict. As days turned to weeks in the aftermath of the disaster, the scattered survivors faced the reality that the world they had known was gone forever. The tsunami had not simply damaged their homeland, but had fundamentally transformed it into something entirely different. The survival strategies, cultural practices, and social institutions that had sustained their communities for thousands of years would need to be completely rebuilt to address the challenges of their new environment. Some groups attempted to maintain traditional ways of life by concentrating on the largest remaining islands, pooling their resources and knowledge to recreate familiar patterns of settlement and subsistence. Others recognized that survival required abandoning traditional approaches and developing entirely new strategies adapted to their transformed circumstances. The most successful adaptations emerged from communities that combined traditional knowledge with innovative responses to unprecedented challenges. Survivors who understood marine ecology from thousands of years of coastal living applied this knowledge to exploiting new fishing opportunities created by the changed underwater landscape. Craft techniques that had been used to work with familiar materials were adapted to process the different types of debris and resources that the tsunami had made available. But perhaps most significantly, the disaster had broken the isolation that had previously characterized many Doggerland communities. Refugees from destroyed settlements were forced to seek shelter with groups that might previously have had limited contact, creating opportunities for cultural exchange and innovation that had been rare when people could maintain traditional territories and social boundaries. These forced migrations and cultural contacts accelerated the development of new technologies and social institutions that were better adapted to life in an increasingly maritime environment. Boat-building techniques improved rapidly as different communities shared their knowledge and experimented with designs suited to the deeper, more challenging waters that now surrounded their remaining territories. New forms of social organization emerged that were specifically designed to coordinate resource sharing and mutual assistance across the scattered communities. Traditional leadership structures, based on control of specific territories, became less relevant when those territories had been permanently submerged, creating opportunities for new forms of authority based on specialized knowledge or adaptive skills. The oral traditions that had preserved cultural identity and historical memory for thousands of years began incorporating accounts of the Great Disaster, transforming the traumatic experience into stories that would be passed down to future generations. These tsunami narratives served multiple functions, preserving practical information about survival techniques while also maintaining cultural continuity in the face of unprecedented disruption. Archaeological evidence suggests that some survivor communities maintained connections with relatives and trading partners who lived in areas that had been less severely affected by the disaster. These connections provided access to resources and knowledge that enabled more successful adaptation to post-tsunami conditions, while also ensuring that information about the disaster spread throughout northern Europe. But the window for successful adaptation was closing rapidly as the geological processes that had been reshaping the region for thousands of years continued to accelerate in the aftermath of the tsunami. The massive displacement of sediment caused by the submarine landslide had altered pressure conditions across the entire continental shelf, triggering additional episodes of slope failure that generated smaller but still destructive tsunami events over the following decades. More fundamentally, the Storegga slide had removed a natural barrier that had been protecting much of northern Europe from the full effects of rising sea levels. The submarine landslide had altered ocean current patterns in ways that accelerated the flow of warm Atlantic water into previously cooler northern seas, speeding the melting of remaining ice sheets and contributing to faster rates of sea level rise. The combination of continued land subsidence, accelerating sea level rise, and repeated tsunami impacts from subsequent slope failures created conditions that made long-term survival on the remaining fragments of Doggerland increasingly difficult. Even the most adaptable communities found themselves fighting a losing battle against geological forces that operated on scales far beyond human ability to influence or predict. Within a few centuries of the Great Tsunami, the last habitable remnants of Doggerland had been abandoned as rising seas finally claimed the remaining high ground that had provided refuge for the survivors of the original disaster. The descendants of Doggerland's sophisticated Mesolithic communities were forced to seek new homes in the highlands of Britain or on the European continent, carrying with them whatever remained of their ancestral knowledge and cultural traditions. Yet the story of Doggerland's destruction and the remarkable adaptations of its survivors would not be forgotten entirely. The trauma of witnessing an entire landscape disappear beneath the waves left lasting impressions that influenced the mythological and religious traditions of the northern European cultures for thousands of years to come. Flood narratives that appear throughout the oral traditions of Celtic, Germanic, and Scandinavian peoples may preserve distant memories of the great disaster that destroyed humanity's first continental homeland. The waves had transformed the very character of the waters surrounding what remained of Doggerland, creating new challenges that tested the limits of human adaptability. Where once predictable tidal patterns had governed the rhythm of daily life, survivors now faced chaotic currents that carried debris from the disaster across vast distances, creating navigation hazards that made even short journeys between nearby islands perilous undertakings. The debris fields themselves told stories of the civilization that had vanished beneath the waves. Fragments of wooden structures that had taken skilled craftsmen months to construct now floated as scattered remnants across miles of open water. Carved bone implements that represented generations of accumulated technical knowledge drifted among broken pottery and torn fishing nets, creating haunting reminders of the sophisticated material culture that had been lost in a matter of hours. But for the survivors struggling to rebuild their lives on the remaining patches of high ground, these floating remnants of their former world presented both opportunities and painful memories. Salvageable materials could be repurposed for immediate survival needs, though the process of recovery required confronting constant reminders of family members, neighbours, and entire communities that had disappeared in the flooding. The psychological toll of this recovery process cannot be understated. Survivors who had lived their entire lives within stable communities that maintained consistent social relationships and cultural practices suddenly found themselves among strangers, forced to cooperate with people whose customs, dialects, and survival strategies might differ significantly from their own familiar traditions. These cultural differences, which had previously been manageable when communities could maintain separate territories and interact primarily through trade and seasonal gatherings, became sources of tension and conflict when refugee populations were forced into close contact on limited areas of remaining land. Disputes over resource access, leadership authority, and appropriate responses to their desperate circumstances created additional stress for people already traumatized by the unprecedented disaster they had witnessed. Yet these same conditions of forced cooperation and cultural mixing also generated remarkable innovations as survivors combined knowledge from different traditions to develop new solutions to unprecedented challenges. Fishing techniques that had been developed by communities living in different parts of the former Doggerland landscape were shared and modified to address the changed conditions of the post-tsunami marine environment. Boat construction methods evolved rapidly as builders incorporated design elements from various regional traditions while experimenting with new approaches suited to navigating the deeper, more turbulent waters that now surrounded their refuges. The result was a period of intense technological development that compressed innovations that might normally have required centuries into the span of a few generations. The social innovations that emerged during this period were equally significant. Traditional kinship systems that had governed marriage, inheritance, and political authority for thousands of years proved inadequate for communities composed of refugees from multiple destroyed settlements. New forms of social organization developed that emphasized skills, knowledge, and leadership abilities rather than ancestry or territorial control. These emerging social structures created opportunities for individuals who might never have achieved positions of influence under traditional systems. Women who possessed specialized knowledge of marine resource processing found themselves in positions of authority as their skills became crucial for community survival. Young adults who demonstrated exceptional abilities in boat handling or navigation gained respect and influence that would have taken decades to acquire under normal circumstances. The religious and spiritual traditions that had sustained Doggerland communities for thousands of years also underwent dramatic transformations as survivors struggled to understand the cosmic significance of the disaster they had experienced. Traditional beliefs about the relationship between human communities and the natural world required fundamental re-examination in light of the overwhelming destructive power that had been unleashed without warning or apparent cause. Some survivor groups interpreted the tsunami as evidence that their ancestors had somehow violated important spiritual obligations, leading to divine punishment that had destroyed their homeland. These communities developed new ritual practices designed to restore proper relationships with supernatural forces while preventing future catastrophic events through careful observance of spiritual requirements. Other groups concluded that the disaster demonstrated the fundamental unpredictability and danger of natural forces that operated beyond human understanding or influence. These communities developed fatalistic worldviews that emphasized adaptability and resilience rather than attempts to control or predict environmental changes through spiritual means. The most successful survivor communities appeared to be those that developed hybrid approaches, combining practical adaptation strategies with spiritual frameworks that provided meaning and cohesion during the difficult process of cultural reconstruction. These groups maintained essential elements of traditional religious practices, while modifying them to address the new realities of their transformed environment. Archaeological evidence from the centuries following the Storegga tsunami reveals the gradual emergence of new cultural patterns that reflected successful adaptation to life in an increasingly maritime environment. Tool assemblages show growing emphasis on marine resource exploitation and boat-related activities, while artistic traditions begin incorporating motifs and themes related to water, waves, and maritime life. The settlement patterns that developed during this period differed markedly from those that had characterized pre-tsunami Doggerland communities. Rather than the relatively stable, permanent villages that had been possible when ample territory was available, post-disaster communities adopted more flexible, mobile lifestyles that enabled rapid relocation in response to changing environmental conditions. These mobile communities developed sophisticated systems for caching resources at multiple locations across their territories, creating networks of supply depots that could sustain them during forced migrations or extended periods of environmental stress. The knowledge required to maintain these cache systems represented a new form of landscape management that was specifically adapted to conditions of environmental uncertainty and territorial instability. The oral traditions that preserved cultural memory and practical knowledge also evolved to address the changed circumstances of post-tsunami life. Traditional stories that had emphasized the importance of maintaining stable relationships with particular places and resources were supplemented by new narratives that celebrated adaptability, courage in the face of uncertainty, and the ability to create new homes in unfamiliar environments. These evolving oral traditions served crucial functions in maintaining social cohesion among communities composed of refugees from different backgrounds. Shared stories about the Great Disaster and subsequent survival experiences created common cultural references that helped forge new identities among people who had lost their traditional territorial and kinship connections. The development of these new cultural identities represented one of the most remarkable aspects of the post-tsunami adaptation process. Within a few generations, communities that had originated as collections of disaster refugees had developed distinctive customs, dialects, and material cultures that reflected their unique historical experiences and environmental adaptations. These emerging cultures retained important elements of their Doggerland heritage while incorporating innovations that reflected their new circumstances. Traditional craft techniques were modified to work with different raw materials that were available in their changed environment. Seasonal movement patterns were adjusted to take advantage of new resource opportunities while avoiding the environmental hazards that had become more common in the post-disaster landscape. The economic systems that sustained these evolving communities also required fundamental restructuring. The extensive trade networks that had connected Doggerland communities across vast distances could not be re-established in the fragmented island environment that remained after the tsunami. Communities were forced to develop greater self-sufficiency while also creating new, more localized exchange relationships with their immediate neighbors. This shift toward local self-sufficiency encouraged the development of more diversified subsistence strategies that reduced dependence on any single resource or environmental zone. Communities that had previously specialized in particular types of resource exploitation were forced to develop broader skill sets that enabled them to take advantage of whatever opportunities their limited territories provided. The technological innovations that emerged from these adaptation pressures represented significant advances over the pre-disaster tool traditions that had characterized Doggerland communities. The need to maximize the utility of limited raw materials encouraged the development of more efficient manufacturing techniques and more versatile tool designs that could serve multiple functions. Fishing equipment became increasingly sophisticated as communities developed specialized tools for different marine environments and target species. The varied conditions created by the changed underwater topography required different approaches in different locations, leading to rapid diversification of fishing technologies and techniques. Boat building evolved from a relatively standardized craft tradition into a highly specialized field that produced vessels designed for specific purposes and environmental conditions. The deeper, more turbulent waters that now characterize the region required larger, more seaworthy boats for long-distance travel, while the complex topography of the remaining islands created demand for smaller, more maneuverable craft for local transportation and resource exploitation. The knowledge systems required to support these technological developments became increasingly complex as communities accumulated experience with their transformed environment. Navigation techniques had to be completely redeveloped to account for changed current patterns, new underwater obstacles, and altered relationships between remaining landmarks. Weather prediction methods required similar reconstruction, as the changed geography created new local climate patterns that differed from the conditions that traditional forecasting knowledge had been designed to address. The deeper waters and altered coastal configurations affected wind patterns, fog formation, and storm development in ways that made traditional weather lore unreliable or even dangerous to follow. Resource management strategies also underwent fundamental changes as communities learned to exploit the new ecological opportunities created by the disaster while avoiding the environmental traps that could lead to resource depletion or community displacement. The changed marine ecosystems required different harvesting techniques and seasonal timing to maintain sustainable yields. The social institutions that governed access to resources and resolved conflicts over their use had to be completely rebuilt to address the new realities of life on small, isolated islands where resource scarcity could quickly become critical. Traditional systems based on territorial control were replaced by more flexible arrangements that emphasized cooperation and mutual assistance while still providing mechanisms for resolving disputes and maintaining social order. These evolving social systems created new roles and responsibilities for community members, while also establishing new forms of leadership and decision-making authority. The expertise required for successful survival in the post-disaster environment often resided with individuals who would not have held positions of influence under traditional social hierarchies, creating opportunities for social mobility and innovation. Women's roles within these communities expanded significantly as their traditional knowledge of food processing, textile production, and childcare became even more crucial for community survival under the difficult conditions of the post-tsunami period. The loss of many adult males during the disaster itself also created practical necessities for women to assume responsibilities that had previously been restricted to men. Young adults found themselves bearing unprecedented responsibilities as the loss of elder community members created gaps in traditional knowledge and leadership that had to be filled by whoever possessed relevant skills and abilities. This acceleration of social maturation created a generation of leaders who had learned to make critical decisions under extreme pressure while still developing their own cultural identities. The children who grew up in these post-disaster communities developed worldviews that differed fundamentally from those of their parents and grandparents who remembered life in the original Doggerland landscape. For these younger generations, the maritime environment and mobile lifestyle represented normal conditions rather than adaptations to catastrophic change. This generational difference in perspective created both opportunities and challenges for community development. The adaptability and innovative thinking of young people who had never known environmental stability contributed to successful technological and social innovations. However, their limited connection to traditional cultural practices and values sometimes created tensions with older community members who sought to preserve important elements of their ancestral heritage. The resolution of these intergenerational tensions required the development of new cultural transmission methods that could effectively communicate traditional knowledge while also encouraging the innovations necessary for survival in changed circumstances. Storytelling traditions evolved to include both preservation of ancient wisdom and celebration of successful adaptations to new conditions. Educational practices also transformed as communities recognized the need to prepare children for life in an environment that was fundamentally different from anything their ancestors had experienced. Traditional apprenticeship systems were modified to emphasize flexibility and cross-training that would enable individuals to contribute to community survival in multiple ways. The spiritual dimensions of this educational transformation were particularly significant as communities struggled to maintain connections to ancestral beliefs, while also developing new understanding of their relationship with natural forces that had proven capable of overwhelming destruction. Religious instruction had to address both the preservation of traditional spiritual practices and the development of new ways of understanding divine power and human responsibility. These evolving spiritual frameworks provided crucial psychological support for communities coping with ongoing uncertainty and loss, while also offering practical guidance for decision-making in situations where traditional knowledge proved inadequate. The integration of old and new spiritual concepts created religious traditions that could provide both continuity with the past and adaptability for future challenges. The artistic traditions that emerged from this period of cultural reconstruction reflected the complex emotional and practical realities of life in the post-tsunami world. Traditional art forms were modified to incorporate new themes and materials, while also serving practical functions that supported community survival and social cohesion. Decorative elements on tools and boats began incorporating wave motifs and other maritime imagery that reflected both the changed environment and the traumatic memories of the Great Disaster. Personal ornaments and ceremonial objects developed new symbolic meanings that honored the memory of lost communities, while also celebrating successful adaptation to new circumstances. Music and dance traditions evolved to include new compositions that commemorated the disaster and its aftermath, while also providing emotional outlets for grief, anxiety, and hope. These performance traditions served important social functions by creating shared cultural experiences that helped forge new community identities among people from diverse backgrounds. The linguistic changes that occurred during this period of cultural transformation were equally significant as communities developed new vocabularies to describe their changed environment and new social realities. Traditional place names became obsolete as familiar landmarks disappeared beneath the waves, requiring the development of new naming systems for the remaining islands and marine features. Technical terminology expanded rapidly as communities developed new tools, techniques, and environmental knowledge that had no precedence in their traditional languages. The need to communicate about navigation hazards, weather patterns, and resource opportunities in the changed marine environment drove innovations in descriptive language that enriched the expressive capabilities of surviving dialects. Social terminology also evolved to address new forms of relationships and responsibilities that had emerged from the disaster experience. Words for different types of refugee status, resource sharing arrangements, and leadership roles reflected the social innovations that had been necessary for community survival and reconstruction. These linguistic developments contributed to the emergence of new cultural identities that combined elements from multiple pre-disaster traditions while also incorporating innovations that reflected the unique historical experiences of post-tsunami communities. The languages that emerged from this period of cultural mixing and adaptation preserved important connections to ancestral traditions while also enabling effective communication about new realities. The gradual stabilization of these new cultural patterns occurred over several generations as communities developed sustainable relationships with their transformed environment and established social institutions capable of maintaining continuity across changing leadership and demographic fluctuations. The most successful communities were those that achieved effective balances between preservation of traditional values and adaptation to new circumstances. But even as these survivor communities achieved relative stability and prosperity within their limited island territories, the larger geological processes that had destroyed Doggerland continued to operate with relentless inevitability. The sea level rise that had been gradually reducing their homeland for thousands of years showed no signs of slowing, while the land subsidence that affected their entire region continued to lower their remaining refugees closer to the advancing waters. The descendants of Doggerland's original inhabitants found themselves engaged in an ongoing retreat from the advancing seas, forced to abandon successive settlements as rising waters claimed even the highest ground that had once seemed safely above the reach of normal flooding. Each abandonment required communities to compress their accumulated possessions and cultural materials into whatever could be transported to new locations that offered temporary safety. This pattern of repeated displacement created a nomadic lifestyle that was fundamentally different from the settled existence that had characterized human communities in the region for thousands of years. The constant need to remain mobile and prepared for evacuation influenced every aspect of cultural development, from the types of tools and possessions that communities maintained to the social institutions that governed their relationships. The psychological impact of this ongoing uncertainty was profound, as communities struggled to maintain hope and cultural identity while facing the gradual but inexorable loss of their ancestral homeland. The knowledge that their current refuges were only temporary way stations in a longer process of displacement created emotional challenges that required new forms of spiritual and social support. Yet even under these increasingly desperate circumstances, the communities that had emerged from Doggerland's destruction continued to demonstrate the remarkable resilience and adaptability that had enabled their ancestors to thrive in challenging environments for thousands of years. Their responses to ongoing crisis revealed fundamental aspects of human nature that transcend specific cultural or environmental circumstances. The final chapters of Doggerland's human story would unfold over the course of several more centuries, as rising seas gradually claimed the last habitable remnants of what had once been a vast continental landscape. But the cultural traditions, technological innovations, and social institutions that had emerged from the Great Disaster would not disappear with the final submersion of their island refugees. Instead, these hard-won adaptations would travel with the refugees who finally abandoned their shrinking homeland to seek new lives in the highlands of Britain and the European continent. The knowledge systems and survival strategies that had been developed through generations of struggle against rising seas would prove valuable in many different environments, while the cultural traditions that had sustained communities through unprecedented challenges would enrich the societies that welcomed Doggerland's final emigrants. The story of Doggerland's end thus represents more than simply the destruction of a landscape and the displacement of its human inhabitants. It reveals fundamental truths about human adaptability, cultural resilience, and the complex relationships between human communities and the natural forces that shape their environments. The lessons learned by Doggerland's people during their final centuries of existence would influence the development of Northern European civilization for thousands of years to come. The survivors who finally departed Doggerland's last shrinking refugees carried more than just their personal possessions and immediate families. They transported entire libraries of accumulated knowledge stored within human memory, sophisticated understanding of marine environments that would prove invaluable in their new coastal homes, and cultural traditions forged through generations of adaptation to environmental catastrophe that would influence Northern European societies in ways we are only beginning to understand today. Archaeological evidence from sites across Britain and continental Europe reveals the profound impact of these Doggerland refugees on the communities that welcomed them during the final centuries of the 8th millennium BC. Sudden innovations in boat-building techniques, fishing technologies, and coastal resource management appear in the archaeological record at precisely the time when rising seas were claiming the last habitable portions of the sunken continent. The refugees brought with them intimate knowledge of tidal patterns and marine ecosystems that had been refined through thousands of years of life in an increasingly aquatic environment. Their understanding of seasonal fish migrations, optimal shellfish harvesting techniques, and navigation methods for challenging coastal waters represented technological advances that took centuries for indigenous populations to develop independently. More significantly, the social institutions that had emerged from Doggerland's prolonged crisis provided models for organizing communities under conditions of resource scarcity and environmental uncertainty. The flexible leadership structures, cooperative resource-sharing systems, and conflict resolution mechanisms that had enabled survival on isolated islands proved equally valuable for managing the tensions that inevitably arose when refugee populations integrated with established communities. The spiritual traditions that had sustained Doggerland's people through repeated disasters offered profound insights into the relationship between human communities and natural forces that operated beyond human control. Their religious practices emphasized adaptability, resilience, and acceptance of change as fundamental aspects of existence, providing psychological frameworks that helped both refugees and their hosts cope with the ongoing environmental transformations affecting all of Northern Europe. But perhaps most importantly, the refugees carried with them oral traditions that preserved detailed accounts of the Great Tsunami and its aftermath. These stories served multiple functions within their new communities, providing practical guidance about disaster preparedness while also offering compelling narratives about human courage and adaptability in the face of overwhelming challenges. The flood narratives that became central to Northern European mythology preserve remarkably accurate information about the geological processes that destroyed Doggerland. Descriptions of walls of water arriving without warning from the northeast, the sudden submersion of vast inhabited landscapes, and the heroic efforts of survivors to maintain their cultural traditions while adapting to transformed environments reflect genuine historical memories that were transmitted through oral tradition for thousands of years. These mythological accounts influenced the development of religious and philosophical traditions throughout Northern Europe, contributing to worldviews that emphasize the impermanence of human achievements and the importance of maintaining harmonious relationships with natural forces. The concept of cyclical destruction and renewal that appears in Celtic, Germanic, and Scandinavian mythology may derive ultimately from Doggerland's traumatic transformation from continental landscape to marine environment. The technological innovations that emerged from Doggerland's final centuries continue to influence Northern European material culture long after the last islands had disappeared beneath the waves. Advanced boat-building techniques that had been developed for navigating the treacherous waters around the sinking continent were adapted for use in rivers, lakes, and coastal environments throughout Britain and continental Europe. Fishing equipment designs that had been perfected for exploiting the changing marine ecosystems around Doggerland's remnants provided templates for developing more efficient harvesting techniques in other aquatic environments. The specialized tools and methods that had enabled communities to maintain themselves on increasingly limited island resources proved equally valuable for maximizing productivity in the marginal environments where many refugee populations initially settled. The preservation techniques that had been essential for maintaining food security during the uncertain conditions of life on shrinking islands influenced food storage and preparation methods throughout Northern Europe. Knowledge of marine resource processing, seasonal preservation strategies, and emergency food preparation became particularly valuable as populations throughout the region faced their own challenges from rising sea levels and changing climate conditions. The integration of Doggerland refugees into existing communities created opportunities for cultural exchange and innovation that accelerated technological development throughout Northern Europe. The combination of indigenous knowledge systems with the hard-won survival expertise of the refugees produced hybrid cultures that were better adapted to the challenging environmental conditions that characterized the early Neolithic period. Marriage relationships between refugees and indigenous populations facilitated the transmission of specialized knowledge, while also creating kinship networks that connected communities across vast geographical distances. The children born from these unions inherited cultural traditions from both backgrounds, creating new generations of people who possessed diverse skill sets and flexible approaches to environmental adaptation. The artistic traditions that emerged from this cultural mixing reflected the complex emotional and practical realities of life during a period of rapid environmental change. Decorative motifs that combined indigenous symbols with maritime imagery developed by Doggerland communities created new visual languages that expressed both continuity with ancestral traditions and adaptation to contemporary circumstances. Musical and storytelling traditions evolved to incorporate both indigenous cultural themes and the disaster narratives that refugees brought from their lost homeland. These hybrid performance traditions served important social functions by creating shared cultural experiences that helped forge new community identities among people from diverse backgrounds. The linguistic influences of Doggerland refugees on Northern European languages can still be detected in modern dialects through careful analysis of maritime terminology, place names related to coastal features, and vocabulary associated with fishing and marine resource exploitation. Words for specific boat designs, fishing techniques, and navigation methods that appear throughout Northern European languages may derive from the specialized maritime culture that developed during Doggerland's final centuries. Place names along the coasts of Britain and continental Europe preserve memories of the Doggerland refugees through references to specific types of coastal features, settlement patterns, and resource exploitation strategies that reflect their unique environmental experiences. The distribution of these linguistic traces provides insights into the migration routes and settlement patterns of the final emigrants from the sunken continent. Archaeological evidence for the continuing influence of Doggerland cultural traditions appears in the form of specialized tool types, architectural features, and burial practices that spread throughout Northern Europe during the period when the last islands were disappearing beneath the waves. The appearance of new technologies and cultural practices at multiple sites across vast geographical areas suggests coordinated migration movements rather than random dispersal of refugee populations. Settlement patterns from this period show evidence of planned colonization strategies that reflect sophisticated understanding of environmental assessment and resource evaluation. Refugee communities appear to have deliberately selected settlement locations that offered similar environmental opportunities to those they had exploited in their island homeland, while also providing access to new resources that could supplement their traditional subsistence strategies. The defensive site locations and fortification techniques that appear in the archaeological record during this period may reflect the social tensions that inevitably arose when large numbers of refugees sought to establish themselves in territories that were already occupied by indigenous communities. The need to negotiate access to resources and territory while maintaining distinct cultural identities created complex political situations that required innovative solutions. Some refugee communities appear to have maintained their maritime orientation by establishing settlements in coastal locations where they could continue practicing the fishing and marine resource exploitation techniques that had sustained them during their final centuries on the sinking islands. These coastal settlements often became centers for further technological innovation as refugees adapted their traditional knowledge to new environmental conditions. Other groups moved inland and established settlements in river valleys and lakeside locations where they could apply their understanding of aquatic ecosystems to freshwater environments. The fishing techniques, boat building methods, and water management strategies they had developed for survival in the challenging conditions around Doggerland proved equally valuable for exploiting inland water resources. The most successful refugee settlements appear to have been those that combine their specialized maritime knowledge with indigenous expertise in terrestrial resource exploitation. These hybrid communities could take advantage of both aquatic and terrestrial resources, while also maintaining the flexibility and adaptability that had enabled survival during the environmental crises that preceded their migration. The agricultural innovations that began appearing throughout Northern Europe during this period may reflect the influence of refugee communities that had been forced to develop intensive food production techniques during their final centuries on increasingly limited island territories. The need to maximize productivity from small areas of arable land had encouraged experimentation with crop varieties, soil management techniques, and agricultural scheduling that proved valuable in many different environments. The development of more sophisticated trade networks during this period facilitated the spread of innovations and cultural traditions that had originated in Doggerland refugee communities. The extensive social connections that these migrants maintained with relatives and trading partners in multiple locations created channels for transmitting technological knowledge and cultural practices across vast geographical areas. These trade networks also provided mechanisms for maintaining cultural identities and social relationships that transcended the geographical boundaries of individual settlements. Refugee communities could maintain connections with their cultural heritage while also participating in the broader economic and social systems of their new regions. The religious and ceremonial sites that were established by refugee communities often became important centers for cultural preservation and innovation. These locations served as focal points for maintaining traditional spiritual practices while also accommodating the religious beliefs and customs of indigenous populations. The monumental architecture that appears at some of these sites reflects the influence of Doggerland building traditions that had been adapted for constructing permanent settlements rather than the mobile structures that had been necessary during the final period of island life. The transition from temporary to permanent architecture represented a fundamental shift in how these communities understood their relationship with their new environments. The burial practices that developed in refugee settlements often combined traditional Doggerland customs with indigenous mortuary traditions, creating hybrid ceremonial systems that honored both cultural backgrounds while establishing new forms of social identity. These burial sites preserve important information about the social integration processes that enabled successful cultural adaptation. The educational systems that emerged within refugee communities reflected the need to transmit both traditional knowledge and new survival skills to children who would grow up in environments very different from their parents' homeland. The development of formal instruction methods for teaching specialized skills like navigation, boat building, and marine resource processing ensured that crucial knowledge would not be lost during the cultural transition. The success of these educational efforts can be measured by the persistence of Doggerland-derived technologies and cultural practices throughout Northern Europe for centuries after the final submersion of the original homeland. The knowledge systems that had been developed through generations of adaptation to environmental crisis continue to provide valuable guidance for communities facing their own environmental challenges. The seasonal movement patterns that characterized many refugee settlements reflected the mobile lifestyle that had been necessary for survival on the shrinking islands of Lake Doggerland. Rather than adopting the sedentary agricultural lifestyle that was becoming common throughout Europe, many refugee communities maintained flexible territorial arrangements that enabled them to exploit resources across large geographical areas. These mobile settlement systems required sophisticated coordination and planning to avoid conflicts over resource access while maintaining the social relationships necessary for mutual assistance during difficult periods. The organizational skills that had been developed for managing life on isolated islands proved equally valuable for coordinating activities across terrestrial landscapes. The conflict resolution mechanisms that had emerged from Doggerland's crisis period provided models for managing the disputes and tensions that inevitably arose when different cultural groups shared limited territories. The diplomatic traditions that had enabled cooperation between diverse refugee populations during the final island period continued to facilitate peaceful relationships in their new continental homes. The legal systems that developed in areas with significant refugee populations often incorporated elements of the flexible, consensus-based decision-making processes that had evolved during Doggerland's environmental crises. These hybrid legal traditions emphasized restoration and reconciliation rather than punishment, reflecting the practical necessities of maintaining community cohesion under challenging circumstances. The economic systems that emerged from refugee settlements demonstrated remarkable innovation in developing sustainable relationships with new environments while maintaining cultural traditions that emphasized cooperation and resource sharing. The market systems and exchange networks that developed in these communities often served as models for broader economic development throughout Northern Europe. The craft specialization that had been necessary for survival on resource-limited islands continued to influence economic development in refugee settlements, creating centers of excellence for boat building, fishing equipment production, and marine resource processing that served markets throughout Northern Europe. The knowledge of astronomical observation and navigation that had been essential for survival in the complex maritime environment around Doggerland's final islands contributed to advances in calendar systems, agricultural timing, and long-distance trade coordination that influenced cultural development throughout the region. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Doggerland's destruction lies not in the specific technologies or cultural practices that survived the catastrophe, but in the fundamental insights about human adaptability and resilience that emerged from 8,000 years of successful adaptation to environmental change, culminating in survival through the most devastating natural disaster in European prehistory. The story of Doggerland's people reveals humanity's remarkable capacity for innovation and cultural adaptation when faced with challenges that exceed anything in previous experience. Their responses to gradual environmental change, sudden catastrophic destruction, and ongoing uncertainty provide timeless lessons about the relationship between human communities and the natural forces that shape their environments. The courage and creativity they demonstrated while maintaining cultural identity through unprecedented challenges offers inspiration for modern communities facing their own environmental crises. The knowledge systems and social institutions they developed for thriving under conditions of uncertainty remain relevant for anyone seeking to understand how human societies can successfully adapt to rapid environmental change. Their story reminds us that even the most devastating natural disasters cannot completely destroy the accumulated wisdom, cultural traditions, and innovative capacity that enable human communities to rebuild and create new forms of prosperity in transformed environments. The legacy of their remarkable adaptation continues to influence Northern European culture today through countless small traces embedded in languages, technologies, and cultural practices that preserve their memory across more than 8 millennia. As you drift towards sleep tonight, remember that the waves washing against modern shores carry echoes of the same forces that once transformed an entire continent, and that the resilience displayed by Doggerland's people lives on in the human capacity for adaptation, innovation, and hope in the face of any challenge the future might bring. The morning light that would never again shine upon Doggerland's vast plains began to filter through the waters of the North Sea, illuminating a transformed world where only the highest peaks of what had once been rolling hills now pierced the surface as scattered islands. These lonely outcrops, barely visible above the waves at high tide, marked the final resting places of communities that had witnessed the end of their world and somehow found the strength to begin anew. Archaeological evidence recovered from these submerged landscapes tells a story that extends far beyond simple survival. In the decades and centuries following the Great Tsunami, the scattered survivors of Doggerland's destruction achieved something remarkable. Rather than merely enduring in their drastically reduced circumstances, they created entirely new forms of human culture adapted to life in an environment unlike anything their ancestors had ever experienced. The boat-building traditions that emerged from this period represent perhaps the most visible evidence of this cultural renaissance. The vessels discovered in underwater archaeological sites from the post-tsunami period show design innovations that far exceeded anything that had been developed during the thousands of years when Doggerland existed as a continental landscape. These weren't simple survival craft hastily constructed from salvaged materials, but sophisticated marine architecture that demonstrated profound understanding of hydrodynamics, materials science, and maritime engineering. The hulls of these advanced boats show evidence of construction techniques that required coordinated efforts from multiple skilled craftsmen working with specialized tools designed specifically for shipbuilding. The precision joinery, waterproof sealing methods, and reinforcement strategies visible in their construction reveal technological sophistication that would not be matched in Northern Europe for thousands of years. More remarkably, these boats were designed not merely for local transportation between nearby islands, but for long-distance voyaging across open ocean waters. Their size, cargo capacity, and seaworthiness indicate that the survivors of Doggerland's destruction had developed the capability for extended maritime expeditions that could cover hundreds of miles while carrying substantial loads of people and supplies. The navigational knowledge required to undertake such voyages safely represents another extraordinary achievement of the post-disaster period. Without the familiar landmarks that had guided travel across the continental landscape for millennia, survivors were forced to develop entirely new methods for determining direction and position while traveling across seemingly featureless expanses of ocean water. The astronomical observation techniques they developed during this period show remarkable sophistication in using celestial phenomena for maritime navigation. Star charts preserved in symbolic form on surviving artifacts demonstrate detailed knowledge of seasonal changes in stellar positions, lunar cycles, and the relationship between celestial movements and oceanic conditions. Perhaps even more impressively, they developed methods for reading subtle environmental cues that enabled navigation during overcast conditions when astronomical observation was impossible. Their understanding of wave patterns, watercolor variations, bird behavior, and wind characteristics provided alternative navigation systems that could guide voyagers safely across vast distances, even when weather conditions prevented celestial observation. The settlements that these accomplished mariners established on the remaining islands of their shrunken homeland show evidence of sophisticated resource management strategies that enabled sustainable communities despite severely limited territorial resources. Rather than simply exploiting whatever materials happened to be available on their particular islands, they developed systematic approaches to resource procurement that treated the entire archipelago as an integrated economic system. Specialized communities emerged on different islands based on the particular resources available at each location. Islands with suitable stone outcrops became centers for tool production that supplied cutting implements and weapons to communities throughout the archipelago. Locations with favorable conditions for drying fish or processing marine plants developed into regional centers for food preservation and distribution. The coordination required to maintain these specialized production networks across dozens of scattered islands, separated by miles of open water, demonstrates organizational capabilities that rival those of much later complex societies. The logistics of transporting raw materials to processing centers, distributing finished products to consumer communities, and managing quality control across such an extended network required sophisticated administrative systems and communication methods. The social institutions that govern these inter-island economic relationships show remarkable innovation in developing cooperative frameworks that could function effectively without centralized political authority. Rather than relying on hierarchical control systems that might have been vulnerable to disruption if key leadership figures were lost, the post-tsunami communities developed consensus-based decision-making processes that distributed authority among multiple individuals and communities. These distributed governance systems proved remarkably resilient when tested by the continuing environmental challenges that characterize life in the post-disaster period. When individual islands became uninhabitable due to continued sea level rise or storm damage, the affected populations could be absorbed into other communities without causing system-wide disruption or resource conflicts. The flexibility of these social arrangements enabled rapid adaptation to changing circumstances while maintaining the cultural continuity necessary for preserving specialized knowledge and technical skills across generations. Children born into this system grew up understanding that cooperation and mutual assistance weren't merely desirable social values, but essential survival strategies in an environment where individual communities could face existential threats with little warning. The educational systems that developed within these communities reflect the practical necessities of transmitting complex technical knowledge, while also maintaining cultural traditions that provided meaning and identity. Young people received intensive training in multiple specialized skills rather than focusing on single areas of expertise, ensuring that communities could maintain essential capabilities even if particular individuals were lost to accidents or disease. The curriculum included not only practical skills like boat building, navigation, and resource processing, but also extensive training in oral traditions that preserved historical knowledge, environmental wisdom, and cultural values. The survivors understood that their ability to maintain their identity as a distinct people depended upon preserving the stories, songs, and ceremonial practices that connected them to their ancestral heritage. The artistic traditions that flourished during this period demonstrate the remarkable human capacity for creating beauty and meaning even under the most challenging circumstances. The decorated objects discovered in post-tsunami archaeological sites show artistic sophistication that equals or exceeds anything produced during the prosperous continental period that preceded the disaster. Carved bone implements display intricate geometric patterns and naturalistic designs that required hundreds of hours of skilled labor to complete. Personal ornaments made from rare materials show evidence of artistic exchange networks that connected communities across vast distances. Ceremonial objects incorporate symbolic elements that reflect both traditional religious concepts and new spiritual insights derived from the trauma and recovery experience. The musical traditions preserved from this period reveal emotional depth and cultural complexity that challenges any assumption that survival necessarily requires abandoning higher forms of cultural expression. Song cycles that commemorate the Great Disaster and subsequent survival experiences demonstrate sophisticated understanding of rhythm, melody, and narrative structure that creates powerful artistic statements while also serving practical functions for cultural transmission and community bonding. Religious practices that emerged during the post-disaster period show remarkable creativity in adapting traditional spiritual frameworks to address new existential questions raised by their catastrophic experiences. Rather than simply maintaining ancient beliefs unchanged or completely abandoning their ancestral religious traditions, the survivors developed hybrid spiritual systems that incorporated both continuity and innovation. These evolved religious practices addressed fundamental questions about the relationship between human communities and natural forces that operated on scales beyond human comprehension or control. The tsunami had demonstrated that even the most careful environmental knowledge and sophisticated adaptive strategies could prove inadequate when confronted with geological processes that operated according to their own inexorable logic. The theological innovations that emerged from wrestling with these questions influenced spiritual development throughout Northern Europe as refugees from the sinking islands carried their hard-won insights to new communities in Britain and continental Europe. Their emphasis on acceptance of uncertainty, celebration of adaptability, and reverence for the awesome power of natural forces provided psychological frameworks that helped many communities cope with the environmental instability that characterized the early Neolithic period. The agricultural innovations developed by communities that combined traditional Doggerland knowledge with new environmental opportunities created some of the most advanced food production systems in prehistoric Europe. Rather than simply adopting the farming techniques that were spreading throughout the continent, they developed hybrid approaches that maximize productivity while maintaining the flexibility necessary for survival in an unstable environment. Their intensive cultivation methods enabled remarkable productivity from the limited soil resources available on their island territories. Sophisticated crop rotation systems, soil improvement techniques, and water management strategies produced yields that could support population densities, far exceeding what would seem possible given their territorial constraints. More importantly, they developed preservation and storage techniques that could maintain food security through extended periods of environmental stress. Their understanding of food processing, preservation chemistry, and storage logistics enabled them to maintain substantial reserve supplies that could sustain their communities through multiple seasons of crop failure or resource scarcity. The medical knowledge that accumulated during this period reflects both the practical necessities of maintaining health under challenging conditions and the innovative approaches required when traditional healing systems proved inadequate for addressing new health challenges. The isolation of island life created unique disease patterns that required new treatment approaches, while the stress of ongoing environmental uncertainty created psychological health issues that demanded innovative therapeutic interventions. The herbal medicine traditions that developed during this period show sophisticated understanding of plant chemistry and therapeutic applications that exceeded anything available in contemporary European communities. Their detailed knowledge of marine plants and their medicinal properties provided treatment options for conditions that landlocked communities couldn't address effectively. Perhaps more significantly, they developed holistic healing approaches that addressed both physical and psychological aspects of health and wellness. Their recognition that individual health was intimately connected to community well-being and environmental stability led to treatment. Philosophies that emphasized social support, spiritual practices, and lifestyle modifications alongside herbal remedies and physical interventions. The technological innovations that emerged from their unique environmental circumstances continued to influence Northern European development for centuries after the final submersion of their island homeland. Their advanced understanding of materials science, engineering principles, and manufacturing techniques provided foundations for technological developments that wouldn't be independently discovered elsewhere for thousands of years. Their metallurgy techniques, developed through necessity when traditional stone tool materials became unavailable, represent some of the earliest sophisticated metalworking in Northern Europe. The alloys they created and the forging techniques they developed produced tools and weapons that were superior to anything available to contemporary communities. The architectural innovations required for building stable structures on small islands, subject to storms and flooding, created engineering solutions that influenced construction techniques throughout Northern Europe. Their understanding of foundation systems, structural reinforcement, and weather-resistant construction provided models for building in challenging environments that proved valuable far beyond their original island context. But perhaps their most significant innovation was the development of social technologies that enabled human communities to maintain cooperation, cultural identity, and technological advancement under conditions of extreme environmental stress and resource limitation. The governance systems, educational methods, and conflict resolution mechanisms they developed provided templates for organizing human societies that could function effectively during periods of rapid change and uncertainty. These social innovations proved particularly valuable as environmental change accelerated throughout Northern Europe during the Neolithic period. Communities throughout the region faced challenges from rising sea levels, changing climate patterns, and resource scarcity that required exactly the kinds of adaptive strategies and cooperative frameworks that had been pioneered by Doggerland survivors. The refugee communities that eventually left their sinking homeland carried these social technologies with them to their new homes in Britain and continental Europe, where they contributed to the development of increasingly sophisticated societies capable of managing complex environmental and social challenges. The influence of their innovations can be traced through archaeological evidence across Northern Europe for centuries after their migration, appearing in the form of new settlement patterns, technological developments, and social institutions that reflect the hard-won wisdom of people who had learned to thrive under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Their story demonstrates that human communities possess remarkable capacity for innovation and adaptation when faced with existential challenges, and that the most devastating disasters can become catalysts for cultural development that transcends anything that might have been achieved under stable conditions. The legacy of their remarkable achievements continues to resonate today through countless small influences embedded in Northern European culture, technology, and social organization. Their example provides inspiration for modern communities facing environmental challenges by demonstrating that human creativity, cooperation, and determination can overcome even the most overwhelming natural disasters. As the final islands of Doggerland slipped beneath the waves sometime around 5,500 BC, they carried with them the physical remnants of one of Europe's most remarkable civilizations. But the cultural innovations, technological advances, and social wisdom that had emerged from 8,000 years of adaptation to environmental change continued to influence human development throughout Northern Europe for millennia to come. The story of Doggerland's destruction and renewal reminds us that civilizations are not defined by the landscapes they inhabit, but by the knowledge systems, cultural traditions, and social relationships that enable human communities to create meaning and prosperity wherever they find themselves. Even the most complete environmental transformation cannot destroy the accumulated wisdom and innovative capacity that represents humanity's greatest achievement and most enduring legacy. Tonight, as you sink into peaceful sleep, let the story of these remarkable people remind you that human communities possess unlimited capacity for adaptation and renewal, and that even the most challenging circumstances can become opportunities for growth, innovation, and the creation of new forms of beauty and meaning that enrich the world for countless generations to come. Generations to come. The waters that claimed the last remnants of Doggerland carried more than just the physical traces of a vanished world. They bore witness to the final chapter of humanity's first great experiment with maritime civilization, a cultural achievement so profound that its echoes would ripple through northern European consciousness for thousands of years after the last island disappeared beneath the advancing waves. In the decades following the complete submersion of their ancestral homeland, the descendants of Doggerland's survivors found themselves scattered across the coasts and highlands of a continent that was itself undergoing dramatic transformation. The same geological forces that had destroyed their island refuge were reshaping the entire geography of northwestern Europe, creating new coastlines, altering river systems, and establishing the maritime boundaries that would define human settlement patterns for millennia to come. The communities that emerged from this great dispersal represented something entirely unprecedented in human history. These weren't simply refugee populations seeking temporary shelter until they could return to familiar territories. They were the carriers of cultural innovations and survival strategies that had been forged through generations of adaptation to environmental catastrophe, possessing knowledge and skills that made them uniquely qualified to thrive in the unstable conditions that characterized early Neolithic Europe. Their arrival in established communities throughout Britain and continental Europe triggered cultural transformations that extended far beyond the simple addition of new population groups. The technologies they brought with them revolutionized local economies, while their social institutions provided models for organizing communities that could maintain stability and prosperity despite ongoing environmental uncertainty. The boat-building knowledge that had been essential for survival in Doggerland's final centuries found immediate application in the river systems and coastal waters of their new homes. Communities that had previously been limited to basic dugout canoes for water transport suddenly gained access to sophisticated vessel designs capable of carrying substantial cargo loads across challenging waters. These technological transfers occurred through carefully structured apprenticeship relationships that ensured the preservation of specialized knowledge while adapting construction techniques to local materials and environmental conditions. Young craftsmen from indigenous communities learned not only how to build the advanced boats, but also the underlying principles of hydrodynamics and material science that enabled innovation and improvement of existing designs. The fishing technologies that accompanied these boat-building innovations transformed the economic foundations of coastal communities throughout northern Europe. Specialized equipment designs that had been developed for exploiting the unique marine ecosystems around Doggerland's scattered islands proved equally effective for harvesting resources from rivers, lakes, and coastal waters in very different geographical settings. More significantly, the resource management strategies that had enabled sustainable harvesting from severely limited island territories provided frameworks for maximizing productivity from much larger continental resource bases. Communities that had previously struggled with seasonal food scarcity learned techniques for processing, preserving, and storing marine resources that could support much larger populations through extended periods of environmental stress. The astronomical knowledge that had been essential for navigation in the featureless waters around Doggerland's final islands found new applications in agricultural planning and ceremonial scheduling throughout their new continental homes. The sophisticated understanding of seasonal patterns, celestial cycles, and the relationship between astronomical phenomena and environmental conditions enabled much more precise timing of planting, harvesting, and other agricultural activities. These innovations contributed to agricultural productivity increases that supported population growth and cultural development throughout Northern Europe during the crucial transition period, when hunter-gatherer societies were adapting to increasingly sedentary lifestyles based on food production rather than resource extraction. The social technologies that had emerged from Doggerland's extended crisis period proved equally valuable for managing the complex challenges of cultural integration between refugee populations and established communities. The consensus-based decision-making processes that had enabled cooperation among diverse groups during the survival period provided models for resolving conflicts and coordinating activities between communities with different cultural backgrounds and economic interests. These institutional innovations became particularly important as population pressures increased throughout Northern Europe due to both demographic growth and continued environmental changes that reduced the amount of habitable territory available for human settlement. The diplomatic traditions and conflict resolution mechanisms developed by Doggerland's survivors provided crucial tools for maintaining peaceful relationships between communities competing for access to increasingly scarce resources. The educational systems that had been developed for transmitting complex technical knowledge across generations of island dwellers influenced learning traditions throughout Northern Europe by demonstrating the effectiveness of cross-training approaches that prepared individuals to contribute to community welfare in multiple specialized areas rather than focusing on single areas of expertise. These educational innovations proved particularly valuable during periods of rapid cultural change when communities needed to adapt quickly to new technologies, environmental conditions, or social circumstances. The flexibility and adaptability that characterized Doggerland educational traditions enabled much faster adoption of innovations and more successful responses to changing conditions than would have been possible using more rigid, specialized training approaches. The artistic traditions that had flourished during Doggerland's final centuries influenced creative development throughout Northern Europe through the introduction of new decorative motifs, manufacturing techniques, and aesthetic concepts that reflected the unique cultural synthesis that had emerged from prolonged environmental crisis. The symbolic systems that had developed for representing complex relationships between human communities and natural forces provided artistic vocabularies for expressing cultural concepts that indigenous communities had lacked effective means for communicating. These artistic innovations facilitated cultural exchange and understanding between different groups, while also providing frameworks for developing new forms of creative expression that reflected the changing realities of life in post-glacial Europe. The religious and ceremonial practices that had evolved during the survival period offered spiritual frameworks for understanding and coping with environmental uncertainty that proved valuable for communities throughout Northern Europe as they faced their own challenges from changing climate conditions and resource availability. Rather than simply imposing their spiritual traditions on indigenous communities, Doggerland refugees typically engaged in complex processes of religious synthesis that combined elements from different belief systems to create new spiritual frameworks that could serve the needs of culturally diverse populations living in rapidly changing environments. These synthetic religious traditions often emphasize themes of renewal, adaptation, and cooperation that reflected the practical necessities of life during periods of environmental transition, while also providing psychological support for individuals and communities coping with loss, uncertainty, and the challenges of cultural change. The monumental architecture that began appearing throughout Northern Europe during this period shows clear influence from Doggerland building traditions, though adapted for permanent construction rather than the portable structures that had been necessary during the final island period. These architectural innovations reflected both practical knowledge about construction in challenging environments and symbolic concepts about the relationship between human communities and the landscapes they inhabited. The burial practices that developed in areas with significant Doggerland refugee populations created new forms of mortuary ritual that honored both traditional cultural values and the unique historical experiences of survival and adaptation that had shaped their communities. These ceremonial innovations influenced funeral traditions throughout Northern Europe, while also providing mechanisms for maintaining cultural identity across generations of life in new environments. The trade networks that emerged from refugee settlements facilitated the spread of innovations and cultural practices across vast geographical areas, while also providing economic opportunities that enabled successful integration between different population groups. The commercial relationships that developed often transcended simple resource exchange to include cultural transmission, technological transfer, and social cooperation that enriched all participating communities. The agricultural innovations that combined Doggerland knowledge with continental farming techniques created some of the most productive food systems in Neolithic Europe. These hybrid approaches enabled communities to achieve food security, while also maintaining the flexibility necessary for adapting to changing environmental conditions or unexpected challenges. The medical knowledge that had accumulated during the survival period proved valuable for addressing health challenges that affected communities throughout Northern Europe during the environmental transitions that characterized the early Neolithic period. The holistic healing approaches that emphasize community support and lifestyle modifications alongside herbal treatments provided therapeutic frameworks that could address both individual health issues and community-wide wellness concerns. The technological innovations that had emerged from resource scarcity and environmental challenge continued to influence tool development, manufacturing techniques, and engineering solutions throughout Northern Europe for centuries after the refugee populations had integrated into their new communities. These innovations often provided the foundations for technological developments that wouldn't be independently discovered elsewhere for thousands of years. The legal systems that developed in areas with mixed populations often incorporated elements of the flexible, restorative justice approaches that had been necessary for maintaining community cohesion during the crisis period. These hybrid legal traditions emphasized rehabilitation and community healing rather than punishment, reflecting practical understanding of the importance of maintaining social cooperation under challenging circumstances. The linguistic influences of Doggerland refugees can be detected throughout Northern European languages in the form of specialized terminology related to maritime activities, environmental observation, and community organization. These linguistic traces provide evidence for the profound cultural impact of refugee populations on the societies that welcomed them during their migration period. The place names that commemorate Doggerland settlements and cultural features appear throughout Britain and continental Europe, preserving geographical memory of refugee communities while also indicating the extent of their territorial distribution during the integration period. These toponymic traces provide insights into migration patterns and settlement strategies that complement archaeological evidence for refugee movements. The seasonal movement patterns that had been essential for survival on resource-limited islands influenced territorial organization throughout Northern Europe as refugee communities introduced more flexible, mobile approaches to landscape utilization that proved valuable for managing resources across larger continental territories. The craft specialization that had been necessary for maintaining complex technologies with limited raw materials continued to influence economic development in refugee settlements, creating centers of excellence that served regional markets, while also providing models for organizing specialized production that could support larger populations. The knowledge preservation systems that had enabled cultural continuity through periods of extreme stress influenced information management traditions throughout Northern Europe by demonstrating effective methods for maintaining essential knowledge across generations while also enabling innovation and adaptation to changing circumstances. And so the last whispers of Doggerland fade into the depths of history, leaving behind a legacy that flows through every coastal village, every fishing boat, and every story of survival told around northern European fires. The great continent that once stretched between Britain and Denmark may have vanished beneath the waves, but the courage, innovation, and wisdom of its people live on in the cultural DNA of an entire region. Their remarkable journey from catastrophic loss to extraordinary adaptation reminds us that human resilience knows no bounds, and that even when our world changes beyond recognition, we carry within us the power to rebuild, to innovate, and to create something beautiful from the ruins of what came before. Sleep well, knowing that the same strength that carried Doggerland survivors through their darkest hours flows through humanity still.